here's what I think what we will do. I'm going to lay out a couple of ground rules to just create a structure for our conversation. They will then probably tear down those ground rules because they have no self-control. And frankly, both of them have probably thought about this more than I have. And we will need your help then filling in some blanks within that conversation. What we'd like to talk about is how time is treated, particularly in movies and television. And I have noticed, I don't know if you have noticed this, but a lot of movies that deal with time as a major theme tend to pit one time against another as a source of conflict, often the central conflict in the story. So we'll call this category time war stories. Okay, so these are stories where, for example, you're trying to change the past, either by going back in time or by maybe it's like a propaganda type story, trying to forget something, or maybe you're trying to reawaken something dangerous in the past because of discontent with the present. So these are stories like Terminator, or even the brief occult scene in Prince Caspian. You can also see this kind of theme in stories where they are perhaps risking the good things of the present in the pursuit of a utopian future. Like in half the superhero movies, the villains are often doing that. Or perhaps they're seeking knowledge of the future in order to rule the present, like in Paycheck. Or maybe they're just fixing a point in the past to change an undesired future, like in Back to the Future 2. So that's category A, time war stories. But there's a second way that stories can frame the relationship between time periods, and I'm going to call these redeeming the time stories. There's a phrase that Scripture, both Ephesians and Colossians, uses for the phrase that's the theme of our weekend, what to do with the time that is given to us. And that phrase is redeeming the time. If you have a King James Bible, it's in both Ephesians and Colossians. I think in the NIV, it's only in one of them and used a different phrase. In the other, I forget which is which though. But the idea of redeeming the time in these letters is the idea of living our moments wisely, not in short-sighted enjoyment of or bitterness about the present, or even investment in the temporal future, right? Like just for working towards retirement or something like that. But living the moments wisely as a piece of eternity. So it's partly about using your moments well, knowing that they are limited, but it's more about the idea that time itself isn't the curse that you think it is. It isn't the limiting force that you think it is, like Matthew talked about early in his talk. The present is, in fact, a window into eternity if you can understand it well. So redeeming the time stories might look to explore the past to find meaning and redemption in the present. We mentioned briefly Greta Gerwig's Little Women adaptation last night. That would be an example of that. Or using well the time that is given to us, like Maverick or Edge of Tomorrow. Or looking at the importance of a healthy view of the past or the future, perhaps by omission or by doing it backwards, like Memento or Interstellar. At which point it's really a time war story trying to do the work of a redeeming the time story. So we can have a conversation about that.
You're breaking your own categories.
I know.
Before we even start.
We have no self-control on this panel. Or maybe it's just wrestling with the hard questions of a past that seemingly can't be redeemed, which is like the entire subplot of every season of The 100, or Black Widow's character in the Avengers. So the second way is a little harder to understand, I think, so we might have to pull some T.S. Eliot in. By the way, if you guys how many of you have read the poem Ash Wednesday? Oh, excellent. So we'll probably have to get into that at some point. But by way of backstory, in case we start quoting it indiscriminately at you, which has been known to happen when Michelle and I get together. Ash Wednesday, T.S. Eliot saw his poem Ash Wednesday as, and I'm quoting him, a sketchy application of Dante's Vita Nuova to modern life. Vita Nuova was a poem that Dante wrote before his Divine Comedy, I think.
It was, yes.
Yeah, and it was trying to explore the relationship between the momentary intensity of romantic love, courtly love, and the eternal divine meanings in the created order. Like when I fall in love with somebody, when I am sort of worshiping that other person, there's something happening here that is echoing a much larger thing that's in the whole fabric of the universe. It's the sort of thing, right, that a lovesick teenager would write. A really thoughtful lovesick teenager. So T.S. Eliot looks at this situation, lovesick teenager trying to make universal pronouncements about the nature of the universe, and he goes, I can make that harder. And one time I read this story once, he was asked by a woman, so, what do you mean by the line, 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree? And he leans in close to her and he says, lady, I mean 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree. But the story the poem seeks the redemption of time, not through time war, not through moral scorekeeping, but through grace. So if that comes up, which is statistically likely, that's a little bit of background for you. Before we start talking actual stories, I'm joined, you all know Matt from the podcast, and you may not know Michelle as well if you haven't been to our conferences before. Michelle ran the first ever Imagination Redeemed with me. She's been involved since the beginning and is again, I'll give you Michelle in a nutshell, all right? Michelle, this would have been, 7-8 years ago. We had a cocktail party at my house, because that's what we do. And a couple hours into the evening, this is usually the part where the evening has devolved into, 4 people over here, 2 people over here. You found something, if you're still here, you have found something that's keeping your attention, or someone that's keeping your attention. There's 5 conversations going on at once. No, Michelle's in the room. So what has happened is she's sitting in a corner holding court, teaching the entire room about Dostoevsky, which almost no one in the room has I think you were talking about Crime and Punishment, and almost no one in the room had read it. And everyone's just sitting there spellbound, and I want to read Crime and Punishment now, tell me more. So if we were going to talk about themes in storytelling, we had to have Michelle with us. So thank you both for being here. Any initial reactions to the way that I framed this?
Can you write the categories up on the board so I can see? I just want to see. Go ahead, Matt.
All right. Well, Brian, I would like to start by calling into question the entire premise of your questions.
Out!
but no, I was thinking about it, and whenever you set up categories, there's always these gray border areas in between them. And there seem to be border areas on 2 ends. One, there's the border area between the time war and the redeeming time, because I think, looking ahead a little, a lot of the examples we're going to use for time war could be sort of judo flipped into being redeeming the time. So to take one example, Back to the Future, it is 2 timelines pitted against each other. But in another sense, Marty is trying to put things back to the way they were before he accidentally screwed everything up. So you could do that with a lot of stuff. So there's some gray area there.
I think, in that sense, I think there's probably 2 different categories between Back to the Future and Back to the Future 2.
Yes. But Back to the Future 2 is another consequence of Back to the Future 1.
Yes.
Okay, so then on Redeeming the Time, there's a gray line between things that go into the Redeeming the Time category and just story in general. Because I think you can make an argument that pretty much any story that is told could be categorized as a Redeeming the Time story.
That's certainly what Heidi White would say.
So let me give you an obvious example here. Okay. I'll be thrilled if someone raises their hand here. Is anyone familiar with the short-lived sitcom Watching Ellie? Okay, I didn't think so. So after Seinfeld, all the other actors sort of go off and fail at different shows. And Julia Louis-Dreyfus' first failed show was a sitcom called Watching Ellie, where their premise was each episode would take precisely 22 minutes. It would be 22 minutes in real time. So they'd set a rundown clock, and it would be a 22-minute slice of life. And if you're thinking that's weird and it wouldn't work, you're correct. Because there wasn't any editing of time, it just came across as weird. They'd have to show Ellie like walking down a hallway for no reason, going down the stairs for no reason, all these things that are a part of daily life. But if you're writing a story or you're, making a movie, it all gets cut. So you're taking out all this Chronos time and just keeping the Kairos time in any sort of story. So that could all therefore be under the redeeming the time umbrella?
So we're done?
No. I'm going to rephrase it. I ended in a question mark, so it could all be under the redeeming time umbrella.
Okay, good. You got rid of the upspeak. I appreciate that.
Yeah. But other than that, I have plenty of examples for both of these, with all that said.
All right. Anything?
Brian, are we trying to make a distinction between what type of story is better? Or are we just coming up with categories? Are we pitting these categories against each other for which one is more effective narratively?
Ooh, that's good. Is there something pejorative about the time war category?
Why don't we... So, let's table the answer to that to some extent. I want to see what we think as we explore it. I have a theory, and I'm sure I telegraphed it in my introduction, but I want to see if it holds up to a whole room full of people exploring it. And I also want to see along the way if we can find what we think the best time movie or TV show ever is, depending on how these criteria hold up.
Oh, excellent.
So we could end up concluding, actually, these are both very legitimate ways of dealing with time and very useful ways of exploring meaning and all kinds of good stuff through a story. Or we might end up concluding, actually, one of them tends to lead to less correct or less healthy conclusions. Let's find out.
Excellent. Well, let's start categorizing.
Okay.
Let's see if we are understanding these correctly.
Okay, well, we've named a few already, but help me out. Like, what stories can you think of that might fit in one of these categories? And if you're not sure what category it should go in, throw it out anyway and we can argue about it.
Star Trek 4.
Where?
Star Trek 4, where they approach destroying the world and the crew has to go back in time to get humpback whales and bring them back to the future. So
Redeeming the time.
More of a redeeming the time one? Yep.
Never seen Star Wars 4, but now I want to. Oh, did I say Star Wars? Sorry.
Oh, rookie mistake.
What else? Yep.
Isn't that more time tourism, though, than redeeming the time? Isn't it the whole point to try to be neutral? Thank you. Yes, I concur. It does depend on the episode. Sometimes we are redeeming the time, but usually when his companions are trying to mess something up. Thank you.
What else?
Okay, I have a weird one. In Time with Justin Timberlake.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not a redeeming the time, but it uses time.
It uses time.
Plot device.
So that's one where they live in like this dystopian future where instead of money, you like pay for a cup of coffee with like 5 minutes of your life, and like some people have lots of time and live forever. And Justin Timberlake forms a revolt of the proletariat. And
And I don't think he ever brought sexy back.
No, yeah.
Probably time war then, because we're trying
Well, the premise of it is time war, but as the plot evolves, we'll leave it in time war for now.
Okay, one that I've sort of been trying to categorize. How about Groundhog Day? Is that time war or redeeming the time? Because Bill Murray is stuck in a time loop and he's at war to try to get out of it, but he eventually, spoiler, gets out of it by finally redeeming his time at the end.
Yeah, so that's probably a redeeming the time story. The time war is more of a premise, but this is where it's trying to go.
Yes.
Okay. Groundhog Day. What else?
Is the redeeming the time category mostly connected to the character development? Like what the character is able to learn as a result of the time? Is that
I don't know.
an element, perhaps?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
It's kind of like a Neo Groundhog Day, but Happy Death Day.
This one I've not seen.
There's a new horror movie where a girl keeps dying on her birthday, but she wakes up alive and she has to figure out who's trying to kill her.
Oh.
Pretty good, actually.
All right.
The sequel don't bother.
Okay. Where would you put that one?
Redeeming the time.
Okay.
Same. Oh, go ahead.
Does Christopher Nolan in general just sort of smash the categories? Where would you put Tenet?
I don't know, because it's almost like time is, it's not the war of time.
Yeah, but I don't think there's any conclusions in it.
That's the other problem with Nolan, right? Like you can have a working theory of what he's trying to do, and you have to figure out whether, same problem with Inception, right? Let's just I will throw out as a hypothesis. I'm just going to put Christopher Nolan as a blanket time war spot, and we can argue about that.
Okay, I'm going to show my age here. Does anyone remember?
Time by going to the bank when they made.
Oh, yes.
What?
Nolan redeemed his time from the time he took to make the film.
Pretty clear cut. Do you guys remember Early Edition from the 90s? The man who got the newspaper from the future and then would run around trying to stop whatever catastrophes.
You got tomorrow's news today.
Yes, exactly. And he had a cat. It was quite a charming little TV show from the 90s. No one recalls this? Really? Okay.
Okay, so that's sorry. What was it called?
I think Early Edition.
That
Early
is
Edition.
Time War.
Yeah, that's Time War.
Time War. Okay.
There's one of the time periods is the problem, and I have to fix it.
Right. Two pitted against each other.
Does it have to be sci-fi?
No.
What about A Christmas Carol?
Oh yes.
Oh, that's good.
That's definitely a redeeming the time story.
It's a Wonderful Life book.
And
Back there.
you already mentioned Little Women.
Minority Report.
Yeah.
Oh, that's definitely Time War.
Yes.
That's a good Time War.
Oh yeah.
Oh, no,
Do tell, sir.
Okay.
Terminator, not a Time War story?
Terminator, I think, is redeeming the time because the premise is the robots send Arnold Schwarzenegger back to the past. They begin the time war, but then the humans try to basically undo what the robots are trying to do and keep the same timeline going, so they attempt to redeem the time.
But it's both. But it's the future against the present/past.
But the robots are doing it. Okay, you're right. Yeah.
Planet of the Apes.
Nice.
Not the TV show.
Still look like Avengers Endgame on there.
Oh yeah. Endgame.
The Tomorrow War.
Benjamin Button.
Nice. How would you categorize that one?
Just weird. That one's off the page.
So, has anybody here read the short story, Curious Case of Benjamin Button by Fitzgerald? Okay. So I saw the movie, and I thought the movie was pretty good. I love Fitzgerald. I thought the short story was super weird. It's like just this whole bunch, it's a series of things that happen, then it ends. Maybe that can be any sort of story ever, but okay, anyway. I think the clearest time war, one of the clearest time wars is Prisoner of Azkaban.
Nice.
Also almost screws up the entire Harry Potter series. Like, J.K.
Yep.
Rowling spends the next few books trying to undo what she did in Azkaban.
And then the cursed child happens.
Yeah.
Another redeeming time would be About Tiny Perfect Things.
Yep.
Brian, can you say in a sentence what the redeeming the timelines, the categories?
Yeah, so Time War is more built based on the assumption that two time periods are in conflict with each other. Redeeming the Time understands the time periods as fundamentally not in conflict with each other. And it's more about, so this is about the relationship, the conflicting relationship between time A and time B, and this is about harmonizing the relationship between the time and eternity. or in some sense. So it's not just the question of, are we trying to get things back to the correct way or something? A lot of time war stories start out with conflict and end with, now everything's reharmonized, right? That's not the point. Redeeming the Time is much more concerned with spending the time well, living the time well. I mean,
So almost
The Notebook.
Almost any story where the main character realizes my life has been spent on frivolous things. I need to focus on stuff that really matters.
Sure.
So like Family Man or the end of Disney's Big Shot.
Yeah.
Himself and needs to live for others. So many stories like that.
Mm-hmm.
About Time, another rom-com.
Yep. Wait, I haven't seen that one. Is that a Time War one?
It has Bill Nye and Rachel McAdams, and the men in the family have the power to transport themselves back to a certain time, whether it's like first date or first something, and
It's really like a father-son love story. It's really good.
So where'd you put it?
I'd say Redeeming the Time.
Okay. Anything else we should throw on there before we jump into talking about it more?
Midnight in Paris.
Where would you put that?
Redeeming the Time.
Mm-hmm. In Time War?
I would say.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a couple that start out as Time War and then move into Redeeming Time, like Age of Adeline and Time Traveler's Wife.
Yeah, I agree on both of those actually, because it's not just a question of time starts out in conflict and ends up reharmonized. Like that's still a Time War story, but they actually learn to think about time differently. Yeah. All right.
Oh, how about in Community when Jeff rolls the dice and it's like you're about to create 6 different timelines and there's the darkest timeline?
Yes.
Thank you. I did it, Chris Farley. That was awesome.
And I mentioned Paycheck and Memento earlier. You could sort of put Jason Bourne in Time War too.
I really want to quibble with Memento in the Time War category.
Do tell.
Because yes, like the conflict is that he has this short-term memory loss. Has anyone seen Memento? So fascinating construct. It starts with the last scene of the film, and then you get the first scene of the film, and then the second to last scene, and then the second scene, and it meets in the middle. So this is Nolan at his finest, really, in my opinion, personally. I think he really degraded after that. But the ultimate goal of that different time scale is that he discovers who he is, his identity, and has to reckon with his past. So it's not, you know what I mean? It's a reconciliation with his own self and his own memory. So I really want to put that in the Redeeming the Time category.
Well, I'd back that up actually from the perspective of it's not. It's exploring. I think it's exploring redeeming the time by omission, because basically it starts out with this sort of implicit question of like, who are you when you don't have your memory? Like, who are you when you? Isn't that an odd way of phrasing it in English, right? What's the first thing you do in any story where you have amnesia? Who am I? Not who was I, who am I? Without a past, you don't have a present. And so the very premise of the story, yeah, all right, I'm with you. All right, that should be enough to get us going. Okay, so what are we noticing along the way here? Can you guys see that okay, by the way? Okay.
So one thing I noticed, maybe I'm looking for the wrong things here, but it seems like Time War mostly involved time travel, whereas Redeeming the Time seemed to involve the element of time, but without traveling in time?
Yeah, although, I mean, I don't know, maybe we mischaracterized Star Trek 4. Yeah, there is a lot of time travel in the Time War. And honestly, if we thought about this more, I mean, we could probably think of more Time War ones that are not time. I mean, anytime anytime somebody's trying to, there's more than one way to erase your past. And time travel is one of them in stories. But there's a lot of, but it does kind of tend to end up redeeming the time. Like if somebody bothers to pit time periods against each other, I mean, the most of the examples I can think of are ones where the future is set against the present, in the sense of the megalomaniacal villain who says, I envision this better future, and I'm totally cool killing 50% of the universe in order to do it. You end up with time travel in Endgame to get there, but Thanos doesn't do the time travel thing. He's trying to build the future by destroying the present.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing in the Time War category, then maybe this is an oversimplification, but a value judgment in the Time War category, right? We must prevent this future where the planet is overrun by apes. We must prevent this terrible accident that will happen tomorrow in early edition, right? So to me, that is something that's saying this future or this past is intrinsically bad and we must prevent it. We must work to stop it.
Do you think that's intrinsic to that type of story then? Like you're starting there, like and is that sort of the fatal flaw of the character, or are there situations you can think of where that's a correct judgment?
Well, I don't want my planet to be overrun by apes personally, so I'm team stop Planet of the Apes. I don't think it's necessarily a fatal flaw. I think that, to me, again, what I'm seeing is there's much more external plot in that Time War category, whereas in this Redeeming the Time, I think that the past, present, and future are a little bit more fluid because it's in service of the character growth and development. Again, I might be creating bigger dichotomies than are needed, but...
Well, I mean, one way you could think about that perhaps is the Time War category playing out in that context is it's not, it could be character development focused, but whatever the external events are that are playing out, it's much more about a test of character. Because when you're confronted with that opportunity where something terrible is going to happen or has happened and you need to go back in time and stop, like you're the only one that can stop this thing from happening, and maybe you have to do something terrible to do that. I mean, that's usually probably the internal hinge point of those kinds of stories. Who are you when you have to decide between two wrongs?
So I think we can almost divide Time War into two subcategories, where there's the one where...
Rip it in half, Brian.
This is what you're going to do.
And then we'll divide those subcategories into 5 subcategories.
How many sheets of paper should I get out right now?
But you could break these down into 2 different types. There's one where some outside, usually sinister force, messes with the timeline. And then the heroes are trying to set it back right.
Endgame.
Yeah. Or, Back to the Future. And then there's the other one where something horrible is about to happen or has happened, Prisoner of Azkaban, and then you're monkeying with the timeline to stop that bad thing that actually happened. To me, I'm just going to give my knee-jerk reaction, because I'm guessing a lot of people share this sort of intuition. The first category, where some outside sinister force changes the timeline and you're trying to fix it, sounds a lot more straightforward and less problematic than the other type. It's not just because it kind of messes with some other stuff, but I think the whole Prisoner of Azkaban premise, J.K. Rowling, I'm here, right? But where you're messing with time so that Hermione can go to more classes, and then fixing this one thing so you can save the hippogriff. It's a great hippogriff. But that seems to be, I think there's an implication there that we're messing with time, and that is wrong and unnatural in some way, right? Because it's almost always the villains who are doing that, and the heroes are only supposed to mess with time to fix it.
That's a fair point. And Prisoner of Azkaban's kind of ambiguous on that front. Hermione gets to the end and seems kind of relieved that she doesn't have to deal with the time turner anymore, but mostly because it was stressing her out. You don't actually get to that point at the end. It's very clear they did something good with the time travel, but it's also very clear along the way that horrible things have happened to people who meddled with time.
Right, do you want to touch on the mirror Harrison scene in that whole context?
Say on.
The whole conversation Dumbledore has, right, with Harry about the mirror Harrison, about how people go mad, looking back at things that were before the things they wish were,
Yeah.
and how we can't dwell on those things because they'll destroy us.
So what do we do with that? Because what's J.K. Rowling's theology of the past then in that? Because you can say don't fixate on the past, and that's, I mean, portrayed fairly straightforwardly in Sorcerer's Stone, like just sitting in front of the mirror and wasting away, which is certainly one of the ways you can allow your past to screw with you. But what about, is there a healthier version of that we see in storytelling that doesn't involve just like forget the past, move on?
I think Rowling's view, I think the best way to view Rowling's view of like trying to change the past, to get that unified, you have to view Azkaban as kind of an aberration, which you can see her kind of backpedaling from in later books, like in Order of the Phoenix. She goes out of her way to say that, oh no, all the time turners were broken in the Ministry of Magic, just like trying to get around that. But also, it also contradicts what she said in like you said, that in the mirror, where you don't want to dwell in the past. And I think there's also something fundamental, and I'm trying to figure out a reason to justify this intuition that I think a lot of us share, that it's wrong to monkey with the past. Like there's lots of examples here. Like I'm just thinking there's a remake, it wasn't super good, but there's a remake of The Time Machine that was made a few years ago, where one of the premises is the time traveler, his fiance gets murdered, so he invents the time machine to go and prevent it, but he can't prevent it because the past can't be altered, right? And there's some kind of trippy, was it a Stephen King book, where some guy tries to go prevent the assassination of JFK, but the past doesn't want to be changed.
This brings up the whole idea of fixed points versus unfixed points in time, which I feel like a lot of times.
Which you can really get into ambiguity with Doctor Who.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we can even go like into fate and get into the Iliad or whatever, but it also goes like, I think a lot of our stories are built on the premise, humans shouldn't be screwing with time, even if it's to do something that they think is a good idea. Why is that? And is that just an unconsidered intuition, or you think it's built on a real idea?
I just remembered a movie that we haven't even remotely touched on, Arrival.
Oh yeah,
that's a good one. Yeah.
Where would you categorize that?
Or make a new category, why not? Throw it in.
Okay.
I was
Struck in the emoticon.
Redemption of time, because they're like communicating around a circle to make the circle stay tight.
You might want to add adjustment bureau on the redeeming side.
Okay. I didn't see that because Barack Obama didn't like it.
Then leave it off. But kind of coming back to this question of the fixed points or not changing time, there's just a couple of things, right? So one is there are different visions of time where contingency matters, right? So if you think you can go back and fix the past and therefore fix the present, you think that going back and changing one thing makes a difference. So you believe that what you do in this life makes a difference. Right? So there's that. But if you can't change it, or if everything you do in the past can't change anything going forward, then you believe that time, the story, the narrative is fixed, predestined. And so that's two very different views of how time works.
Yeah.
But quickly on the one of the stories of Endgame, right, is that we have to be very careful about going back and coming. You have to land right at the right place and put the thing right at the right place and come back. And Steve Rogers does not come back, right? So so he fixes his past, but is he fixing it in a way, or is he monkeying with it, or are we supposed to think that's okay?
And then you get into multiverse territory, and then my brain explodes.
Well, isn't it a fine line between agency and hubris? Like, I wonder if there's some kind of instinct that we're usurping the position of God if we try to fix, quote unquote, the past by removing a certain piece of it, right, or change the future. And my other theory about why we have that intuition, that monkeying with time with bad, is I think that the elephant in the room when we're talking about time is mortality. And so I actually wonder if immortality stories like Tuck Everlasting needs to be in its own separate category, because we're also usually making value judgments on that, right? I think Groundhog Day is actually basically a pro-mortality story, right? Being in a loop is actually not our human condition.
That's a fairly common theme, actually, in not necessarily time travel shows, but sci-fi shows where the villain is trying to become immortal in some way, right? That'll come up a lot. Like my favorite. What's that?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example.
Okay, go there. Yeah.
Yeah. So there, I mean, Odysseus is kept prisoner by Calypso, is like a minor goddess, and Calypso, obviously beautiful, perfect goddess, like, hey, Odysseus, you can stay here. You can sort of be my husband, and we'll be on this beautiful island forever, and you'll be immortal. And Odysseus flatly turns her down. And I think the text, correct me if you disagree here, Odysseus doesn't even seem to really consider it. He's like, no, I'm a human. I'm immortal. My place is in Ithaca with my home, with my wife and my community. That's where I'm supposed to be. This is like unnatural.
Yeah. I mean, initially he doesn't really have a choice.
Yeah.
Right.
But he's so mopey, so that she finally, and then she has to be compelled to let him go.
Right.
But the choice is there. Would you like to spend eternity on a beautiful island with all your needs cared for with a goddess, or do you want to go home to your aging wife? Right, and he says, in Ithaca, it's not one of the most beautiful Greek islands, so you could go home there. He's like, I want to go home. Of course I want to go home. And so, yeah.
Well, and Brad, I think by raising this whole sort of category of issue, I mean, you've also just taken us from Prisoner of Azkaban to the entire Harry Potter series, where the villain is, like, the entire series happens because the villain wants to live forever.
Young, beautiful, kind of your life forever is not a lesson when you have to watch your children grow old and die of old age. It sort of shows the dark side.
So kind of piggybacking off that bicentennial man, kind of does the same thing.
Yeah.
Where he like finds love and community and family, and then watches at will, and then refosters it, watches at will.
Yeah, and I mean, we can keep going back to like ancient literature here on both of these. Like, what's the oldest surviving piece of literature? The Epic of Gilgamesh. Premise is Gilgamesh is trying to live forever, and spoiler alert, he can't. It's seen to be a futile effort, and he's seen as having to come to like this moral realization that it's not possible, it's not even something necessarily appropriate for a human to seek. And going back to like the Iliad and Odyssey, you see this coming up all the time with just the relations between the gods and mortals. You'll see Achilles' mother, who again is a minor deity, she's already mourning for Achilles, knowing, hey, I'm going to live forever. Even if my son lives a full life, he's going to die. So I'm just doomed to see this. And seeing the differing perspectives of the gods as opposed to the humans in terms of the way they view time. There's this really interesting scene in the Odyssey where after Odysseus finally makes it back to Ithaca, and he's trying to like figure out how to get back into his home, get all the suitors out, Athena comes to him, and Athena's the goddess who likes Odysseus, and Athena's like, hey, don't worry, I'm here, I've got your back, I'm going to help you. And Odysseus replies, well, why didn't you help me sooner? I've been trying to get back for 10 years. Why are you choosing now? And Athena basically shrugs it off like, well, I don't want to start a ruckus with Poseidon, and 10 years, but I knew you'd get back home anyway. To her, 10 years, if you're an immortal goddess, it's nothing. It's not even worth considering. But to Odysseus or any of us in time, it's like, oh, I could have been back 10 years ago. I could have seen my son when he was 10 instead of 20. That's a huge deal, and that's not something you would think about being an immortal. Yeah.
Speaking of gods and men, I thought of, this could be a whole another category, time standing still. All of these characters are in time. But in the Old Testament, God literally stopped time, stopped the plans from moving when the Israelites were in battle. Because he's outside of time. He's like, there's going to be no time for a little bit here. Tomorrow will be just a normal 24-hour day. Today, I have power over this. I was like, it's a whole other category. No time. Just stay still.
There was a bad, I suspect it was a TV movie from the late 70s, early 80s. Had something to do with a gold watch, where the guy could hit a button on the watch and time would stand still. And he could go and manipulate things around him. But, you know, I don't really remember it, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Did it work out for him, or did it go poorly?
I'm sure it worked out for him, because if it was a made-for-TV movie.
Good answer.
Well, it actually reminds me of an early, I think it was an early David Tennant Doctor Who episode where they go to an alternate universe, and in that alternate universe there's this media conglomerate that downloads all of the news and opinions and everything for the day into little earbud devices that everyone wears all the time. And it's not a story about time per se, but when that download happens, it's the same point every day. It's like everybody knows it's called the download, and everyone freezes for about 10 seconds while they're all getting the download. And there's sort of an interesting, it was made far enough back that it was probably the early days of smartphones, and it sort of felt like, I don't know, like a lot of the ways that our phones kind of own us now. Like, well, the screen is up and time has stopped. That's the only one I can think of. Like those two, like what are there other stories that you guys can think of where time just stands still? Like,
Oh, yeah.
can we exclude Adam Sandler movies as a category? I'm just kidding.
Okay, so I didn't see the whole movie, but I caught the end of one of the newer Doctor Strange movies, and everybody was frozen. But I only saw like the last 10 minutes of the movie, so I don't know the storyline, but probably everybody else does.
Yeah, in the new Loki show, he goes to like a point outside of time.
Yeah, and that nobody's really brave enough to do generally. Well, I mean, we're about out of time, and essentially what we've done so far is we've created a need for 3 follow-up podcast conversations because we've danced around this idea of agency, the idea that well, actually, I'll let you guys talk about this. These are the 3 things I've noticed as far as kind of big takeaways. One is this theme of agency and how we relate to time, the idea that you have power and responsibility. The idea of embeddedness, I loved when you brought that up, Nicole, with the Age of Adeline, but that's a really common one. This idea that we didn't really touch this at all other than mentioning it briefly, but it's one of the things I've picked up from, I can't hold on to a pen to save my life.
He dropped it as he said one of the things I picked up. Anyway.
Nobody likes you, man. But the embeddedness thing is interesting to me because, philosophers and theologians and psychologists have written a lot about that in the context of space, as in like the material world, like the theology of place and the idea that you're actually made to inhabit a relatively small portion of the earth and have, think about all the stories that make us feel kind of like the Shire in Lord of the Rings, like, oh, I wish I knew a place as well as the hobbits know their home, and that idea of home as a place is pretty ubiquitous in a lot of literature. What's less common though is that idea of embeddedness in time, that not only are you as a created being with a body and a soul made to relate to your place, the people who are around you, the people that you have responsibilities and duties to, the place that you call home, but you're also responsible to the time in which you're called, and there's an embeddedness to the time and the relationships. And really the only thing I think of where that comes up a lot is the one where somebody's trying to live forever and they realize, oh, everyone I love is dying. And
well, but I think like if we use, I think really well done redeeming the time stories are actually trying to increase that sense of embeddedness. So like using Christmas Carol as that's a great example, a little unorthodox, right? Like he explores the past and the future that could come in order to become more embedded in the current time. Like that is the goal, right? And a lot of times when movies are playing with time, sometimes going to the past is what gives you perspective to live more effectively in the future. So, you know, I think that's a very good and very Christian idea, that looking at the past and the future, right, can make us actually more embedded and not detached and isolated and floating out in time war land.
Mm-hmm. There's a great line in I just was about to utter the sentence. There's a great line in Paycheck, which is not the greatest movie ever made, but there's a great line in the movie where they create a machine that can see the future, and then he sees in the future and realizes that the people who can see into the future end up destroying the world. And there's a great line that if you show somebody their future, they have no future. And the sense of having a right relationship to past and future is what allows you to live in the present. The third thing that I noticed that we don't have time to talk about is you know, a couple of you brought up the idea of mortality, the idea that it's actually not good to live forever within the constraints of the time and space world that we currently occupy. And yet we are eternal beings. Like, we will live forever. And the relationship between that, like, there's an interesting tension there that most stories don't deal with, because most of these stories aren't told from a Christian perspective per se. But they do. Yeah, and whether the Rings of Power does well can be a separate conversation.
Highlander.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. I'll leave you with one thought that occurred to me 3 different times in this conversation. There's another Doctor Who episode that's not the best Doctor Who episode, but it has one of my favorite lines. And the episode's called The Lazarus Effect, and this guy's been basically pursuing eternal life and doesn't care who he hurts in the journey. And there's a scene where he's been beaten, and he is sitting actually at the transept of an old church. So the transept is the place in old churches and cathedrals where, because they're traditionally cross-shaped, and the place where communion is actually served is the point where the vertical meets the horizontal in the cross, the place where God meets his people. And he's in that exact spot, looking up almost apologetically as he's dying to David Tennant, and it's saying, I could have been so much more than an ordinary human. And David Tennant looks down and glowers at him in the church and quotes C.S. Lewis at him, "You have never met an ordinary human." So I'll leave you with that thought because we're out of time. But this is one of those conversations that easily could have gone 3 hours, and she could probably have broken it. Well, Matt could have broken it down into fantastic categories, and then Michelle could have interpreted all the categories, but that would have been a 3-hour conversation instead of a 45-minute conversation. So we will leave it there and perhaps pick it up on one or both of our podcasts in the near future.
And please, when you discuss over dinner all the other subcategories we were missing, and let us know.
Yes, come find us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.